Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Mary Fitzgerald. I'm the Director of Expression at the Open Society Foundations and former Editor-in-Chief of openDemocracy. We have a fantastic panel for you today. It's really thrilling to see so many of you joining from all across the world, from everywhere, from Norwich to Lahore. Thank you so much for being with us. Today, the topic could not be more timely. Can we stop big tech getting inside our heads? And this conversation was provoked or prompted by Susie Alegre's fantastic new book, Freedom to Think, The Long Struggle to Liberate Our Minds. Susie is an international human rights lawyer, and she's written this fantastic book, which has been reviewed in the FT, and I will share the link to it after this if you want to follow me on Twitter, to get around the paywall. Not that you should be trying to avoid paywalls, because everyone should be paying for quality journalism. But it's great to have Susie with us here today, and it's also fantastic to have Shoshana Zuboff, who is the author of very famous book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, The Fight for Human Future and the New Frontier of Power. And she's also a professor emerita at Harvard Business School. And we're really thrilled to have her today. Please add your thoughts, questions, suggestions, comments in the chat or on Facebook if you're joining the live stream there, and they'll be fed back to me. We really want this conversation to involve many of you, and thanks to all who submitted really thoughtful questions ahead of time. I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. We've had hundreds of sign-ups, so I'm not going to get to everything, but we will do our best. And I wanted to start with Susie's book, because that was the provocation for today's discussion. Susie, you wrote a book which I found fascinating and also quite frustrating at times, because one of the key things you argue is that we're being manipulated by technology in ways that we never were before. But I found myself arguing with you sometimes, and being like, well, no, actually targeted advertising isn't that good. I'm constantly being followed around by the ghost of the washing machine I bought a month ago on the internet. And no, the claims of Cambridge Analytica, a lot of that was snake oil. But I think what you do really, really well are two things. You point out that actually the debate around whether or not this technology works is actually a real distraction. The question is, should we be allowed, and should we be allowing big tech to try and manipulate us in these ways? And even if it doesn't work, even if it's wrong, even if facial recognition can't point out whether you're gay or not, actually that has some profound implications in places where being gay is a crime and is criminalized. And the other thing that I thought was absolutely fascinating about your argument was the way that you reframe this long argument about digital privacy, data rights, as our right to inner freedom, our right to freedom of thought. Freedom of expression has been something that we have fought over and litigated and taken to the streets about for the last 100 years. But what about our right to freedom of thought? So those were the things that I really took from your book, and I'd love to hear more about them in the discussion. But since that book was published, and since that review was published, some things that we could probably not have anticipated happening, or certainly not anticipated happening so quickly, happened. Number one, Russia invaded Ukraine, and the landscape about the debate about technology and censorship and surveillance is changing really quickly as a result. And number two, Mr. Elon Musk decided that he wanted to buy Twitter. So I'm going to take the war in Ukraine first, and I wanted to come to you first, Susie, and for you to reflect on how that fast-changing situation is changing what you see about the problems that you've described and the opportunities. What's new, what's different, and what actually reinforces the way you see these issues.
Yeah, thanks, Mary, and thanks for the introduction and for the review. And one of the things I noted in your review was this question of, does Ukraine and the way that Putin is engaging, sort of declaring Facebook an extremist organization, does that shift the discussion? Because a lot of the book is looking at the kind of things that companies like Facebook are doing. So many of the examples that I've used are research either by Facebook or about Facebook, because there's a lot of that out there. What I think is really flagged by the war in Ukraine is how when you develop this technology, you never know who's going to be in charge of it. You never know how it's going to be harnessed. So actually, it's not really about a Facebook, the good guys now, because Putin says that they're extremists. And the fact that Facebook is suddenly changing their content moderation in relation to calls for Russian soldiers to die in certain countries, apparently, really puts into focus how dangerous this situation is, and also that content moderation is not really the answer, that the problem we're looking at isn't really about content. It's about the systems and the way that content is curated, managed, and delivered, and how that controls us. And actually, I was looking back just earlier today at the book, and as you know, I looked back at historical examples of the way opinions have been manipulated in the past. And clearly, Nazi Germany is the very obvious example of how propaganda can really capture the minds of a population. And I was looking at a quote from Albert Speer, who was Hitler's Minister for Armaments at his trial in Nuremberg when he was finally held to account, talking about the way that Hitler had harnessed technology to deprive 80 million people of independent thought. And there he was talking about radios and loudspeakers. Fast forward 80 years, we really now need to focus on how technology can be harnessed to deprive billions of people around the world of independent thought. And I think the war in Ukraine really flags the problems there. I don't necessarily have an immediate answer to how we solve those problems, but I think it really points up why we need to worry and why we need to act and why we need to look at the direction of travel of this kind of technology, the way innovation is developing.
And yeah, to your point, it's not about the technology, it's not about the content, it's about the power, right?
Exactly.
Who has the power? Who decides what we see, hear, experience in the world we live in right now? And that's obviously something, Shoshana, you've written and thought about a lot. So I'd love to bring you in too, and just your reflections on what's happened since January and how that's affected your thinking and the way you see things.
Well, I mean, we're still talking about the Ukraine situation. Okay. To me, what's really, I mean, of course, my whole experience of these last months has been the human tragedy and this tension between being a bystander and being a witness. Being a bystander is excruciating. Being a witness confers responsibility. What is that responsibility? I think what we're seeing in Ukraine is something that I spent an awful lot of time thinking about and writing about in The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And that is the new presence of two powers, an old power and a new power. The old power, it has various subspecies: totalitarianism, authoritarianism, autocracy, all somewhat different political structures and consequences. But the new power is what I call instrumentarian power. That's what we've been talking about. That's very much what Susie writes about in her book. This is how we use power, but through the medium of digital instrumentation. Power works on our bodies, on our minds, on our behavior in ways that are hidden, secret, indecipherable, ergo surveillance, undetectable. And these hidden systems, unlike totalitarian power, unlike authoritarian power, they do not show up at our homes, banging on the doors in the dead of night to drag us to the gulag or the camp. They do not point a gun at our temples and, threaten our families. They work in a different way. They work through what is euphemistically called targeting, what is euphemistically called the whole range of algorithmic targeting mechanisms, from supposedly simple recommendations to psychological micro-targeting to real-time rewards and punishments. They work on us in ways that are unseen. And yet they are extremely powerful, and they can shape individual and collective behavior. Instrumentarian power can be responsible for literally changing the tides of society. Who wins, who loses, who lives, who dies. What we've seen in Ukraine, in the Russian preparation for this invasion and its execution, is this kind of convergence of the new and the old power. In many ways, the Russian invasion is a return to the old authoritarianism, with traces of totalitarianism in the way Putin has tried to control all information within Russia. But at the same time, the ground was laid for years, since 2016, at least that we know about, through intentional campaigns of Russian disinformation that moved into the West, that moved into Europe, that moved into America on these slippered feet, with messaging, targeting vulnerabilities of key populations within our societies, sowing division, weakening democratic institutions. And all of that prepared the way and continues to undergird the power that Russia has been able to display. So this is really a challenge now for us, because what we have done, and I'll finish with this one little thought, what we have done is that, we're very oriented toward the big old power that attacks our bodies, the murderous power. But we have tended to underreact, to not take as seriously and not react as forcefully to the new power. But the new power is information warfare. The new power is not information warfare only in the military sphere, but it's information warfare that uses our family photos and all the personal information that a site like Facebook and many others have amassed about us in this supposedly benign form of targeting, to actually get into our heads and shape our behavior. And I can give you, concrete examples of that. This is not something that is a work in progress. This is well established. So we've tended to undervalue that. And we know about cyber space and cyber war and so forth, but this is the weaponization of our own information against us citizens, ordinary citizens in our everyday lives, that has prepared the ground for this real shift in history right now. And that's really, what I want to bring to attention, and how we dissect and learn to identify, resist, overcome, and ultimately outlaw instrumentarian power.
Thank you, Shoshana. There's so much there, and I agree, there are so many rich examples all across the world which back up what you say when it comes to manipulation of various groups of population, subgroups of population, from Myanmar to Ethiopia to January 6th. The war complicates things, though, in some really key ways, or accelerates the complication of this conversation in some really key ways. I mean, number one, you're right to describe it as information warfare, but now one of the key ways of getting any form of accurate news and information into Russia, into occupied Ukraine, and into Belarus, is using precisely these tools that are used to manipulate us: targeted advertising, Facebook pixels. There's a cowboy industry burgeoning, which is actually delivering trustworthy news, factual content into a heavily censored environment. And there's a real ethical question there, right? And then second of all, and this is conversation predates the war, but again makes it far more relevant. We work with journalists all over the world and media organizations all over the world working in authoritarian contexts who say, well, Facebook or Twitter or TikTok or whichever platform, YouTube, still really important in Russia, is our only way, is our only means of communicating directly with citizens and directly with audiences, and avoiding censorship and being able to speak truth to power and to deliver people truth and news. So that's really challenging, because there is an urgent and pressing need to do that right now, and there has been for a long time in many contexts. So I wonder what both of you say to that, because that's complicated, and also the tensions inherent in US big tech business models have never been more apparent than right now. It is so clear that by not prioritizing democracy and the rule of law, it is directly hurting their business. They just got kicked out of Russia, right? They've been labeled extremists. So again, is there an opportunity, an advocacy opportunity here, an awareness raising opportunity? So first, how do we keep information channels open at this critical time, given the complications, the technology and its manipulative use and potential? And second, does this change the conversation? Does this make it more possible to point out the tensions inherent in big tech business models? And I ask that to both of you, really. So Susie first, and then to Shoshana.
On the first question, I've seen these reports of projects using surveillance advertising to get concrete news through, and they made me feel really deeply uncomfortable. As I say, I think freedom of information is vital to freedom of opinion and freedom of thought. So how do you get that information? But this idea of surveillance targeting, targeted advertising, which isn't so much about, oh, you bought a fridge or you were looking at fridges, so maybe you'd like a fridge, but more about, well, you're clearly feeling very distressed about something right now. You're not sleeping at night. You're our kind of target audience. And maybe if we feed you this information, it'll make you go out and protest. That, I think, is crossing the line. And I think we have to be very careful about using techniques that really, in my view, just need to be banned completely. I think claiming that the ends justify the means is a very, very dangerous path to go down. So I feel very, very uncomfortable about that. On the other hand, what you were saying about YouTube, Facebook, etc., being the access to information, in one way they are, but, and, it's not just in Russia, in other places where I've worked, places like Uganda, around election time, of course, you switch off social media and then nobody can find out anything. But that, I think, also flags the vulnerability of relying on these systems for our only way of getting information. So rather than it providing a solution, I think that also flags a problem. I don't necessarily have an immediate solution to bring about world peace right now, but I definitely feel very uncomfortable about using surveillance advertising as what is essentially a propaganda tool, even if that's propaganda for positive effect or, to get out accurate information. And I do think the fact that these platforms have become so crucial as information platforms, but that they're so easily switched off or subjugated is really worrying and should make us reflect on the global information ecosystem.
Thank you. Shoshana?
Well, there's an interesting, let me call it a dialectic here. I think what happened, especially early on, as Putin was shutting down information channels, people were scrambling. And yes, YouTube and you know what they could still get of Facebook. And in my mind, and I take a little different position here than Susie perhaps, in my mind, what this did was it reminded us of what these channels were supposed to be, because they were supposed to be networks, not engineered machine jungles that are defined by surveillance capitalism's economic imperatives. Goodbye, public square. What they were supposed to be was clean channels for folks to communicate to one another across organizational boundaries, across hierarchical boundaries, to create relationship and community where the analog world sometimes impeded that. The crisis reminded us of what we meant, what we expected, what we yearned for, and what we deserve from our digital information and communication spaces. And that opportunity has been taken from us. Why? Because our lawmakers abdicated, consigned these digital spaces to private capital under the auspices of radical economic freedom for them to do whatever they want in whatever way furthered their objectives. And that was the diverging road back in the very early part of the 21st century that set us on the path that we're on today. So I actually love the fact that people were scrambling for good information on what have become pretty much, you know, toxic surveillance channels, because it shows they can still fulfill that promise for us. Our job is to work now politically. We're not going to influence the tech companies. Forget about content moderation. Forget about getting Elon Musk or any other guy to do something better rather than worse. Turn to your lawmakers, turn to Washington if you're American, whatever country you live in, turn to your lawmakers, because the failure here is a failure of law. We do not have the rights and the laws and the institutions to assure that these information spaces are used in ways that advance democracy and democratic ideals and human-to-human communications in ways that are tied to our rights and our choices.
Thank you for that very vigorous and inspiring reminder of the democratic potential of the internet. It is a real tragedy that this technology was developed in the 90s and early noughties, because just when that economic orthodoxy was at its zenith, you know, you think about other radical and transformative technology that was developed in different eras, not at the height of neoliberalism, public broadcasting, all those other channels of communication. And you realize it doesn't have to be the way that it was and the way that it is. Thank you for bringing in Elon Musk. We definitely want to turn to that for a moment. And I really want to spend a good chunk of this conversation talking about what we can do. And you've mentioned the law already. Shoshana, you have described Musk's potential privatization of Twitter cannot be compared to anything else that has ever existed. And yet he has promised to do some things which many in the data rights space have been arguing for quite some time. Interoperability, more transparency about algorithms. I think we probably have consensus here that what this takeover of Twitter does, that there's been no regulatory scrutiny. It shows how beholden our public squares are to capricious interests. But I do want to take a minute to think about what are some of the possibilities, right? So what needs to be done, for example, with that platform, what could be done, and which of those ideas, and I don't think that we should trust him when he makes these promises. He's incredibly leveraged. If Twitter doesn't turn a profit, he could lose Tesla. So there's an incentive on steroids there to make money out of this platform that is not profitable currently. So what does that look like? But for a minute, what are the good things that could be done with Twitter and should be done with Twitter, and then we can go to the deeper questions about power.
I mean, if I should say that, which is maybe not a what should be done, but it should be guaranteed that a global information platform like Twitter cannot just be owned and at the whim of one person, which has nothing to do with Elon Musk and his ideas. It just shouldn't be allowed that a global platform that is designed and operated in a way that does potentially mold opinions around the world should be in the hands of one person. And that goes back to the bigger question that Shoshana spoke about earlier, that, yes, originally these platforms should have been this great equalizer of information and democratic debate, but they're not going to be ever if they are in their current model. So it is time to address the fact that you should never have an information space like this just down to one person's whims, no matter who that person is and no matter what their great ideas are.
Thank you, Shoshana. I've got a feeling I know some of what you're going to say, but that you'll also surprise me.
Well, there's a saying that probably a lot of our viewers have heard. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. We've already lived through this story. The Google founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, were able to engineer their stock holdings so that they essentially controlled voting rights. And what that did back early in the 21st century was it gave these two young guys total control over the organization and presentation of the world's information. How about that? And then a couple of years later, Mark Zuckerberg decided, well, that was a pretty cool idea. So he did the same thing, being able to control the Facebook stock, voting rights. And we've had for quite a few years now, he used to be a young man, not so young anymore, one guy in charge of the largest space of social communication ever existing in human history. How has that worked out? Not well. So the issue here is, again, democracy has stood down. Democracy has been enmeshed in this kind of self-eviscerating drama for the last 20 years. And during that time, these fledgling internet companies with these powerful founders who have access to knowledge and power that in the arc of human history, there is no comparison. The kind of knowledge and power they have access to is what human beings have always associated with words like divinity and God. This is obviously not okay. And it's certainly not okay if we have any expectations of a democratic digital future. So what we have here now is the only thing that's going to make this better. And honestly, Mary, I don't care if it's Elon Musk or Abraham Lincoln, and here Susie and I agree. What we need is a recognition, a whole society recognition across the liberal democracies recognition and a transnational recognition that the digital must live in democracy's house. The digital is not some privileged sphere that gets to be lawless and, you know, where anybody gets to make up the rules just based on what they had for breakfast today. The digital must live in democracy's house, tethered to democratic values and aspirations, tethered to fundamental rights, many of which we need today that have not yet been codified. I hope we talk about that. And tethered in a way that advances the prospects of democracy. So that, why? So that our people and our societies finally get to benefit from the luscious fruits of this digital age. That data is used to improve the lives of people and society and solve our most pressing, challenging problems: climate, disease, hunger, education, health, so that we are finally empowering our communities and our societies with, with all of this knowledge and knowledge production and the problem solving that comes out of artificial intelligence and all the rest of it. Understand that all of these capabilities are now concentrated in the hands of a few surveillance empires. We are not participating in that as people or as society. So we're shifting the trajectory here. And the one thing that I will say to complete this comment, and I hope we can talk about it some more, is that while Elon Musk has captured everybody's imagination because it's, oh, what will Elon do? Forget about that. The real news of this week is that the European Parliament and the Commission and the Council and the member states have finally come together to launch a political agreement on the Digital Services Act. And I hope we can come back and talk about that, because that changes everything.
Thank you, Shoshana. That was exactly going to be my next cue, and back to Susie on this, because the how do we get there question is so live. And the European Digital Services Act and other legislation which has been agreed recently, at least the political deals have been done, have an enormous amount of potential, and yet they also create some potential problems. So it's that thing about how do you harness technology to democracy in a messy global situation where you have elected illiberal authoritarians, where in Europe, for example, some of the laws that platforms will be subject to, that Hungary can pass, that Viktor Orban can pass, that Poland can pass, are pretty scary. And that's, I have a broadly positive view of this new legislation. I think it's groundbreaking. I think it takes us to a different place. So Susie, to you, what are the kind of legal, political, policy, structural mechanisms that harness technology to be accountable to democracy and society, not just government? Because government can be scary, government can be unaccountable, government, even elected, can be illiberal and authoritarian. So just solve that one for us, please.
Yeah, well, I suppose going at it from a really fundamental point, and I'm seeing some of these things coming up in the chat. The first point that's coming up a bit is about it making it a public good. I think that's a great idea, but I'm not quite sure exactly how you do that on an international scale, but I would certainly love to work towards that. But what I think has been really deeply problematic, and it's why, in the introduction to the book, I say this isn't a book about technology, it's a book about human rights. Because certainly from when I started, I had my first job as a human rights lawyer, specifically in 2001, just after 9/11. And the way that human rights and democracy, to a degree, has been attacked fundamentally, including in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom that previously were championing human rights at home and abroad. This was, it was the same year or within a year of the Human Rights Act coming in the UK, and suddenly we're backtracking and finding even the government that brought in the Human Rights Act was suddenly having problems about, well, is the prohibition on torture outdated? And this sort of discourse around human rights has also been captured with the shift in the discussions around tech to talk about ethics and ethical frameworks instead of talking about human rights law. And so human rights law has been painted as something that we can't use, that it's outdated. I think that's fundamentally wrong. And that's why I wrote the book as well, particularly around the right to freedom of thought, which has just not been used. It hasn't been used in the courts. It hasn't really been used in legislation. It's barely been discussed in academia. But I think it has a lot of potential for addressing many of the issues that are being discussed in terms of digital rights, around autonomy, around agency, even around the hardcore of privacy, if you like. And one of the keys and the thing that made, to me, freedom of thought seem like a really good perspective of looking at these questions was the fact that it is an absolute right. It's an absolute right to think what you like inside your head, and therefore needs a much stronger protection. One of the concerns I've...
Just to explain what you mean by absolute right, that it's enshrined in the explain.
Yeah, so in international law, most rights like privacy or freedom of expression can be limited in certain circumstances, particularly to protect the rights of others or in the interest of national security or public health. The right to freedom of thought, to think what you like or to hold and form opinions freely inside your head, not to say what you think, but to think whatever you want, to have that space to decide what you want to share, to not be manipulated, can never, ever be interfered with. So it's like the prohibition on torture, the prohibition on slavery. No one can ever come up with a justification for limiting those rights. There are very few rights in human rights law that are protected so strongly. So we have these rights. What we really need to do now is to start to use them. And talking about the democratic space, aside from the Digital Services Act or the Online Safety Bill, if we look in the UK, but it's happening right across Europe, it's happening across North America, the other threats to legal protection are things that we need to be looking at as much. There's no point talking about, can we have new digital rights, if we lose the Human Rights Act, if we lose the capacity for judicial review, if the people who are charged with regulating this space are not given the money or the powers to do it, or they can be co-opted by whoever happens to have power at the time. So these fundamental questions about democracy, about the rule of law, and about human rights are things that we need to not just ignore while we're too busy focusing on the digital rights space and what new regulation can we have. The Digital Services Act, I think, has gone much further than anyone expected a year, 2 years ago. Still imperfect, and as you say, it may well provoke new problems. But one of the big questions will be how it's implemented and how it's enforced and what it looks like in practice.
Thank you. Yeah, I think so. So we're getting to the solutions, that what can we? And I think litigating international human rights law and just doing more of that strategic litigation at country, regional, international level is
use it before we lose it right now.
Exactly. Well, one concrete answer, and there are countries where this human rights laws are under threat, like the UK, just for people who are joining overseas. But that's interesting because there are other legal theories of change, right? There's a whole bucket of them. So, for example, there's antitrust law, which is gaining traction and momentum in the US. There's labor law. Some of the most successful challenges to the power of big tech have come from workers organizing, Uber, Amazon, workers unionizing. And so I'd be curious to hear both of your thoughts on, and yep, someone else mentioned EU competition law, which is also very, very helpful. I'd be curious to hear both of your perspectives, maybe Susie, just you briefly, and then Shoshana, on which of those you think have most potency and where you think that can go as well.
I don't think it's an either or. And one of the things that I think is useful, I think the US is slightly different in this perspective, but certainly in Europe or in places like Canada, probably in places like India as well, and in the UK, is that law has to be read in light of underpinning human rights law or constitutional rights. So the way you understand law depends on those things. So it's not an either or question. And it's about how you can use those to inform understanding of labor law or understanding of competition law. And so, as I say, for me, using this absolute right to freedom of thought, and I looked at it when I was investigating potential avenues for strategic litigation, addressing the use of mental health data, for example, and the sharing of mental health data by mental health websites with third parties, and looking at interpreting the GDPR, so a data protection piece of legislation in the EU, interpreting that in light of the right to freedom of thought in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. So using broader EU Charter rights to interpret things. And I think you could do the same potentially for competition law or other aspects of law. And it's one of the things that I pointed out in the book is it doesn't necessarily have to be called a law on freedom of thought. It's about using that international framework, understanding how it might apply to other laws that will effectively protect our human rights.
Thank you. And yes, Shoshana, coming to you, and I'm going to reframe the question slightly, because the law is one instrument, but law exists within a society that has certain values, norms, public conversations happening. And it can be subverted in instances where those conversations, those norms, those societies shift. So taking it beyond the how can we litigate, whether it's labor law, competition law, human rights law, what gives you hope? Right? What movements? What ideas? What organizing is out there, or what organizing do you think needs to be out there that is really going to shift the conversation and shift perception and shift our conversation on this?
Well, a very big story from the last 3 years is the shift in public consciousness. So right now, and I think we all realize that the United States has been a little late to the party. Europe had GDPR. They failed to enforce it. I believe that with the Digital Services Act, they're learning from that experience. But the United States, everything we're talking about really began as an American story. These companies began here, but the United States has never enacted even the most basic, comprehensive federal privacy protections. Ergo, the wholesale destruction of privacy in the last 20 years. So we've been late to the party. And yet, if you look at the data now, and this has been a steady drumbeat since about 2018, but now we see in the survey data, majorities in the 90th percentiles, the 80th percentiles of the huge preponderance of Americans saying, curb tech power, enough is enough. I'm happy to take more inconvenience for the gift of my privacy back. Thank you very much. Tech companies should not be allowed to capture information about me without my explicit knowledge and consent in a way that is meaningful, not this performative clicking that we're all trapped into at every step of social participation. So the public rupture of faith is immense. In my understanding of change, this is the huge and necessary first step to really getting our lawmakers to move. They must feel the public at their backs. And of course, this has already been underway in Europe. It's happening in other parts of the world. And now it's happening in America. So there's one small example. We were using the term before, surveillance advertising. Surveillance advertising is sort of the core of the targeted online advertising behemoth that first defined Google, and the invention of surveillance capitalism moved on to Facebook, and still accounts for nearly all of the revenue and profit of those two very important companies. What we've seen over just the last year is we've seen bills introduced in the European Parliament to ban surveillance advertising. We've seen, for example, Alexandra Giza, from a German MEP from the Green Party, as well as Lori Trahan, who's a congresswoman in the States, working together. They did an event last summer on the subject of how to ban surveillance-based advertising. We've seen this just this January, an important bill introduced to the US Congress called Banning Surveillance Advertising, sponsored by Congresswoman Eshoo, who actually represents the district in California where Google is headquartered, as well as co-sponsored by Senator Cory Booker. We have seen who's who of civil society organizations signing a petition which was introduced to the European Parliament to ban surveillance advertising. And we've seen an important civil society organization in the States, Accountable Tech, introduce a petition to the Federal Trade Commission here in America for specific rulemaking that would ban surveillance advertising. These things happened without being orchestrated as, one overall political movement. They bubbled up in different environments with organizations, with individuals, with lawmakers, among the public. But I think this is an unsung story of just how far we have come in consciousness, in awareness, in political mobilization, and in the statement from our peoples that we are no longer willing to tolerate this status quo. And that's why the Digital Services Act is coming at such a critical moment and is benefiting from the sorry, painful learning curve of the past decade, especially, where we've tried to make law and it has not been effective. So with the Digital Services Act, we've got central authority in the European Commission, new institution embedded there that is going to counterbalance the also important opportunity for the member states to have a role in this. And that was done specifically to counter the potential for autocratic influence from the member states. So what we have here is the beginning of the recipe, but we don't have the whole recipe. We need new fundamental rights, the rights to know our own lives, our own experience, and to decide what is shared, with whom, to what purpose, how, and all the rest of it. These are what I call epistemic rights. We have considered them elemental, inalienable, but they have not yet been codified in law. The time has come when they must be codified in law. We need new rights. We need the laws to enforce those rights. And to answer a very important question you asked a little bit ago, Mary, we need new institutions to oversee all of this. In the 20th century, we created many new public institutions to oversee the new rights and laws that defended workers and consumers and other groups in our society and our environment. We need to do the same thing today. We need public institutions that exist under the rule of democratic law, but it's not the same as the state, and it's certainly not the market. These are institutions that endure, that sustain, that have the same democratic brief, even if whoever comes into, whether it's Downing Street or the White House or to lead in Europe, that these institutions are impervious to those temporary political cycles, applying democratic standards to protect and defend the democratic nature of our networked information and communication spaces.
Thank you, Shoshana. And this reminds me of a lot of the work and the conversations I'm having with colleagues at the moment, which is regulation, law enforcement, policies is not going to be enough. The law is slow, technology is fast. I think that part of the answer to this challenge as well is we need new culture, new tools, new networks that mean that the institutions are responsive to new tools that are being built, that are more ethical, that are more transparent, that are more accountable, the networks that use them, that develop them, and the cultures that develop around them. So it's that relationship between those two things. And I'm going to ask at the end of this a question which many of the people who submitted questions ahead of time have asked. I'm going to put this on you, Susie. You talked about how your daughter is banned from having Alexa in her bedroom because Alexa steals your dreams and sells them, which has been an interesting discussion topic with my 8-year-old. Lots of people have asked versions of, in the world we live in right now, not the world we're trying to get, the world we live in today, what can I do? What can my family do? What can we do to better protect privacy? And there's such an opportunity cost in that, right? So like, how can you opt out of this system in ways which don't make you opt out of society? And so, yeah, solve that one in the last remaining 2 or 3 minutes, Susie. Life hack.
I think, yeah, I think it's incredibly hard is the headline. I was asked a similar question when I was talking about tracking apps in the kind of context of the pandemic a couple of years ago. And the only answer I could give was drop your phone in the river if you don't want to be tracked, which isn't very practical. And, I just bought a new iPhone, which I then had to open with my face. So, I'm not immune to these things. I don't have Alexa, but she does pop up as well. Suddenly I discovered that, we've got Amazon Music. So actually we have to actively go and switch Alexa off to make sure she's not there. I suppose from a really basic perspective, some of the things that I've suggested in the book is just making yourself aware of how bad it is. And I mean, one thing that I do, which is really basic, is I leave my phone downstairs. So after about 7 p.m., but I mean, whether you switch it off, leave it in another room, whatever it is, but after about 7 p.m., my phone is not to hand because otherwise I would spend the whole evening just checking things. Whereas actually having made a conscious decision to leave it downstairs, I have a good window of sort of about 12 hours of the 24-hour period where I don't touch my phone or look at my phone. And that is so liberating. It's very small. And like I say, I still unfortunately have facial recognition on my phone. But those kind of things, I think separating yourself bit by bit from the technology, realizing how much it affects you is a good start. But the really big thing is voting and holding politicians to account and demanding change and demanding the kind of protections that we need to live in the world we're living in. And just following up on what Shoshana's just said, I think there is a very big difference between the United States and possibly the rest of the world in terms of the kind of rights that we do already have in law, even though it's becoming increasingly difficult for us to use them. But it's something that I've found very striking, even talking to human rights lawyers in the US, is there's a very different perception of what rights we have and how we can use them in other countries. So I think there are opportunities for using those rights, but finding out more about what companies have on you to make yourself angry. And I suppose the reason I wrote the book was because I've spent years writing policy papers, articles, academic articles, legal opinions. And I thought, actually, what I want to do is write something that people who aren't in this space will read and think about. And I was delighted to get such fabulous endorsements from heroes and somebody like Shoshana, who's written such an incredible book that has been really a linchpin in these changes that she's talking about. But one of my favorite endorsements was Johnny Ryan, who's an incredible privacy campaigner, saying that it's even funny. That was my favorite. I was like, okay, maybe people who've been hesitant and saying, oh, I've seen your book, but I said, look, Johnny Ryan says it's even funny. Honestly, it's fine. There's genocide, but there is also funny bits. And I think it's important to really get the message beyond the echo chamber of those of us who are passionate and working on these subjects, and try and get a broader audience. And I think Shoshana's done that fantastically with her work, and I hope my book will also contribute to that.
Thank you, Susie. Okay, Shoshana, final point, life hacks. What do you do? What do you not do? I'll point out as well that there are all kinds of tech solutions. So you can install the Who Targets Me on your browser to find out if you're being targeted and chased. There are always tech solutions for tech cases. But Shoshana, good to you for any life hacks you would recommend in the last moment we have.
Yeah, well, you know, you don't have to be looking at yourself in the mirror of the network, of the social network. We're talking about freedom of thought today, and freedom of thought is pointless unless you have something to think, unless you are thoughtful, unless you have interesting thoughts that identify you, that give you inner resources, that give you a moral compass, that give you your truth, that give you things to be passionate about, that give you purpose. So I'm for the life hacks that I spend a lot of time thinking. You see, I live in a world of books and people. I hug my people, I kiss my people, and I love my books. And it's about creating those inner resources that give me the strength and the courage to look at something that is wrong and say, this is intolerable. This should not stand. We've got to expose this. We've got to talk about it. We've got to stand together. Nothing is inevitable. Nothing that people have made, nothing that these tech folks have made is inevitable. It suits them at a particular point in history. We're big, we're strong, we're democracy. We've got law. We can change it. We can make this century what we want, a democratic digital century. I feel that strongly because I have those inner resources, and I know that you do too. Just pay attention.
Thank you so much. That is a wonderful note to end on. I really appreciate both of you for joining today. Thank you to my two brilliant panelists. If any of you watching have not yet read Freedom to Think or The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, they're available in all good bookshops. Do not buy them on Amazon. And I hope you have a wonderful good morning, evening, afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. We really, really appreciate you joining today, and please tune in for Open Democracy session next week. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Susie. Great luck with the book.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both.